The dough was cold when Ruth Ellery turned it out onto the board, and her hands were colder. She worked it anyway. The wagon had no stove worth the name, only a sheet iron box she had bolted to a bed of river stones, and it took 2 hours of feeding to bring it up to a heat that would bake. She had learned to start the fire in the dark and let the dough rise against the warm wall of the box while the sky over Wyoming Territory went from black to the color of skimmed milk. It was October of 1887. She was 23 years old, and she had 4 days of flour left. Her father had been dead 11 months. Consumption took him slowly enough that he had time to explain the accounts to her, line by line, sitting up against the pillows with the tally book on his knees, and that was the last true inheritance she received. The bank took the ranch in March. The horses went in April. She kept the wagon because no one wanted it, and the bread pan because no one thought to ask. She shaped 7 loaves. Round, scored twice across the top, set into the box on a bed of ash while the light came up over the ridge. When they came out, they were dark on the bottom and pale gold across the crown, and the smell of them filled the whole cold hollow where she was camped, and for a few minutes she felt like a person with something to offer. She wrapped them in a flour sack, laid them in a basket, and walked the 1.5 miles into Steadman. The town was awake by then. Wagons stood along the street with their tongues down. A man was hammering a shoe onto a mule outside the smithy, and the sound went up and off the hills and came back thin. Ruth kept to the middle of the road because the boardwalk made people move aside for her, and she had grown tired of watching them decide whether to do it. The Voss Mercantile stood at the corner, the largest building in Steadman, with a scale on the counter and a slate over the till where Harlan Voss kept the names of everyone who owed him. He was behind the counter when she came in, a broad man, careful with his clothes, with a face that had learned to look patient while it was refusing you. Ruth set the basket on the counter and folded back the sack. 7 loaves, and I can bring 7 more on Thursday. I will trade even for flour and salt. No credit, no paper, nothing owed either way. Voss looked at the bread and did not touch it. There were 4 other people in the store. A woman with a child on her hip, 2 men from the freight line. Odessa Pike, who kept the boarding house, standing by the dry goods with a bolt of cloth in her hands. Voss reached out and lifted 1 loaf. He turned it over the way a man turns over a horseshoe he intends to send back. Nobody in this town wants bread that came out of a hole in the ground, he told her, loud enough to carry. Nobody wants bread from the Ellery girl. Your father died owing half this county, and the smell of that follows a family. I do not owe you anything. Your name owes me plenty. He carried the loaf out from behind the counter, went through the door onto the boardwalk with it, and threw it into the street. It landed in the churned mud at the edge of the water trough and rolled once and stopped. Ruth heard somebody laugh. Only one man, and only for a second, because the sound of it hung there in the cold and found nothing to hold on to. Then there was no sound at all except the mule shifting outside the smithy. She looked at the loaf in the mud. She had been up since 2 a.m. making it. She had measured the flour with her hand shaking because there was so little of it. She did not cry. And she did not pick it up. She understood that picking it up in front of them would finish something in her that she needed to keep. Then a man came down off the boardwalk across the street. He was tall and unhurried, in a canvas coat gone pale at the shoulders, with a hat he had clearly owned a long while. Ruth knew who he was the way everyone in the county knew. Abel Kincaid ran 9,000 acres north of the creek and better than 2,000 head, and he had come by all of it in 15 years of work that started with 1 borrowed horse. People said he was the richest man between Steadman and the Platte. People also said he had not sat down to supper with anybody since his wife died. He walked into the street. He stopped over the loaf. And then Abel Kincaid went down on one knee in the mud in front of the whole town. He picked up the bread with both hands, the way you would lift something out of a river. He turned it and brushed the mud from the crust with his thumb, slow, taking his time about it, and the street was so quiet that Ruth could hear the dry sound of his thumb going across the crust. He stood up. He tore the loaf open. Steam came out of it because it was still warm. He tore off a piece and ate it, standing there with mud on the knee of his trousers and his hat pushed back, chewing, looking at nothing in particular. He ate a second piece. Then he turned to the door of the mercantile where Harlan Voss stood with his hands hanging. "That is the best bread I have had in 4 years, and it has been on the ground." Nobody answered him. Abel came up the 2 steps and stopped in front of Ruth. Up close his face was weathered and tired, and there was gray coming in at the temple. "What do you get for a loaf?" "4 cents, she told him. "5 if I have to bring it out to you." He took a folded bill and some silver from his coat and counted out coin, and he did not put it on the counter. He put it into her hand and closed her fingers on it with his own hand once and let go. "I will take the 6 that are left. And I want 20 loaves a week at the ranch, every Thursday, starting this Thursday, at 5 cents the loaf. I have 11 men in the bunkhouse, and they have been eating biscuit that could stop a bullet." Ruth looked at the money in her hand. It was more money than she had held since the horses were sold. "You have not tasted the ones that did not fall in the street. I have tasted enough." He picked up the basket himself, tucked it under his arm, and walked out past Harlan Voss without looking at him. At the door he stopped and put his hat back down where it belonged. "Harlan, I have bought my beans and my wire and my coffee off you for 11 years. I would like you to think about how a man decides who he buys from." Then he was gone down the street, and the town let out its breath, and Odessa Pike came across the floor and took Ruth by the arm and said one plain thing. "Come to my kitchen tomorrow. I have an oven going to waste and I am too old to use it right." The road to the Kincaid place ran north and then east along the creek, and it took Ruth 2 hours on foot the first Thursday, carrying 20 loaves in a hamper on her back with a strap across her chest. The gate was open. The house sat on a rise with a windbreak of cottonwoods behind it. A long, low house of squared logs and clapboard, with a porch running the whole front, and it was too big. She saw that right away. It was a house built for a family by a man who had expected to have one. The foreman came out to meet her. Court Beeman, a bandy-legged old hand with a mustache the color of tobacco, who took the hamper off her shoulders before she could argue and carried it to the cookhouse like it weighed nothing. "You the one from town?" "I am." He set the hamper down and looked into it, and something happened in his face that he tried to hide under the mustache. "Well," he told the room in general, "there it is." The crew ate 9 of the 20 loaves that first evening. Court came out afterward and paid her from a tin and asked, very carefully, whether she could do a sweet bread with raisins in it, because it was coming on to winter and the men got low. She could. She did. That was how it began, and it stayed that way through the end of October. Thursdays she walked out with the hamper, and Thursdays she walked back with coin. Odessa Pike gave her the use of the big iron range in the boarding house kitchen in exchange for 2 loaves a day and the ash swept out every morning. And with a real oven under her, Ruth stopped fighting the bread and started making it. Word got around the way word does. The school teacher wanted 4 a week. The doctor wanted 2. The freight men bought whatever was on the table when they came through, and by the middle of November Ruth Ellery was rising at 2 in the morning, 6 days out of 7, and going to sleep in the wagon with her arms aching and money in a coffee tin buried under the floorboard. She bought a second pan. She kept the first one anyway. It was a dented tin loaf pan, blackened on the bottom, with the corner bent where it had been dropped down a step in Missouri before Ruth was born. It had belonged to her mother, who died when Ruth was 6, and who left almost nothing else behind. Ruth used it for the first loaf of every morning, always, and she did not tell anybody why, because it would have sounded foolish said out loud. Abel Kincaid was at the cookhouse the 3rd Thursday, and the 4th, and after that he stopped pretending it was a coincidence. He was not a talker. He would carry the hamper in and stand with his shoulder against the doorframe, and ask her something plain, and then wait a long time for the answer, as if he had all afternoon and no better use for it. "Where did you learn?" "From my mother until I was 6. From a Danish woman who cooked for my father until I was 14. After that, from being wrong about a lot of it." He nodded like that settled something. In December the snow came early and stayed, and on one of those short blue afternoons Ruth found herself on the porch of the big house with a cup of coffee she had not asked for, watching the light go off the ridge. "You do not have anybody up here," she observed. "I have 11 men in court. That is not what I asked." Abel turned the cup around in his hands. "Marta died 4 winters ago. There was a fever went through in February, and it took her and it took the baby the same week. He was 9 days old. I have not said that out loud to anybody in about 2 years, so I would take it kindly if you did not make me say more." Ruth looked out at the snow going blue. "I will not." They stood there a while. "You want to know a strange thing?" he continued. "When I had nothing, everybody in Steadman called me Abel. Now that I have all this, they call me Mr. Kincaid, and they take their hats off when they do it, and not one of them will sit down. A man can get rich and lonesome in the same 10 years and never notice which one is doing the damage." Ruth held the cup against her chest. "When my father was alive, I was Ruth Ellery, and I sat in the second pew, and people asked after me. 11 months after he died in debt, I am the Ellery girl, and I am something they step around in the road. It is the same trick worked backward. Money moved, and they moved with it. They were never looking at either one of us." Abel Kincaid looked at her then, straight on, for longer than was polite. "No," he agreed. "I do not suppose they were." The thing with the ledger happened the week before Christmas. Court Beeman had the tally book open on the cookhouse table and was working at it with a stub of pencil and a great deal of suffering, and Ruth, waiting for her hamper to be emptied, glanced at the page the way you glance at a familiar face in a crowd. Then she stopped and looked at it properly. "May I?" Court pushed it at her with relief. Her father had taught her ledgers the way other men teach their daughters hymns. She could run a column of figures in her head faster than most men could with a pencil, and she could feel a wrong entry before she could prove it, the way you feel a stone in a boot. She went down the page. Then she went back up it. "Your flour comes from the Voss Mercantile. All of it. At what a pound?" Court told her. Ruth put her finger on the entry for November. "You bought 400 pounds in November, and you were charged for 400 pounds. But the sacks come in at 98 pounds when they are honest, not 100, and you have been paying on 100 each time and taking his weight for it. And here in October he has you down for 11 sacks, and the delivery bill under it is for 10. That is one whole sack you paid for that never came off the wagon. It is in the September page, too. And the July page." The cookhouse got very quiet. "That is not a mistake," Court remarked at last. "Mistakes go both directions," Ruth pointed out. "This one only goes the one way. She could have carried that into the street. Part of her wanted to, badly, and she knew exactly which part it was and what it wanted, and she did not trust it. Instead, she waited until Abel came in, and she told him quietly at the end of the table with the book turned toward him, and when he asked what she wanted done about it, she gave him an answer, that surprised him. Nothing yet. If I stand up in Steadman and say Harlan Voss is a thief, they will hear the Ellery girl trying to get even for a loaf of bread in the mud. Let it sit. Weigh your own sacks from now on, and write down what they come to, and say nothing about it. Paper keeps. Abel closed the book. You are your father in the face, he mentioned. But you are somebody else in the head. Harlan Voss made his move on the 6th of January. He did not come himself. He sent the county clerk out to the hollow with a paper, and the clerk stood in the snow looking miserable while Ruth read it twice. It was a promissory note. It said that Thomas Ellery of Steadman, Wyoming Territory, acknowledged a debt of $800 to Harlan Voss for goods advanced, and that the debt fell against his estate and anything the estate had produced since. It was signed with the name of her father. It carried a date in September of the year he died. $800 was more money than Ruth would earn baking for 6 years. Attached to it was a demand. The wagon, the stove box, the 2 pans, every cent taken in since the 1st of October, which Harlan Voss put at a figure he had clearly obtained by asking around town, and it was close. You have until the end of the month, the clerk mumbled. Then it goes before the justice. That same week, Voss did something else, and this one he did in daylight in front of witnesses, and Ruth heard about it before the day was out. Mrs. Alma Dieter, a widow with 3 children, came in to buy flour on the credit she had carried since her husband drowned in the spring crossing. Voss took her sack down, set it on the scale, and told her the price had gone to 9 cents the pound. When she said the slate over the till showed her credit good until March, he turned around, wiped the slate with the side of his hand, and wrote a new figure on it, and told her the old one had been in error. He did it while she stood there. He did it while her oldest boy stood there. That was the sort of man Ruth was up against, and she understood in that moment that the bread in the mud had never been about her at all. It had been a demonstration. He had wanted the town to watch him do it, and to see that nothing happened afterward. Something had happened afterward. Abel Kincaid had knelt down in the street. Harlan Voss had been paying for that ever since. The blizzard came in on the 11th of January, and it shut the valley for 9 days. It started as a gray line on the north rim in the middle of the afternoon, and by dark the wind was up so hard that the Pike boarding house shook on its sills. 2 freight wagons were caught out on the flat and had to be dug to. The pass closed. The rail spur at Coles Junction closed behind it. Steadman had what Steadman had, and no more, until the wind laid down. On the 2nd day, Harlan Voss put flour to $1.50 a pound and took the slate down off the wall entirely and announced that he was selling for cash money only. Ruth was in the Pike kitchen when she heard. She put her hands flat on the table and thought for a while. Then she went out into it. She got as far as the smithy before Abel Kincaid found her, coming down the middle of the street on a big gray horse with the snow driving sideways past him, and he leaned down and hauled her up behind him without a word of discussion and took her back to the Pike door. Inside, with the ice melting off his collar, he heard her out. "I need wheat," she told him. "Not flour. Wheat. You have got 40 sacks in the seed shed off the last crop that came in on the creek land, because Court told me so in November when he was complaining about the mice. There is no mill running in this weather. There is a hand mill in the back of the Pike pantry that has not turned since the war, and there are 200 people in this town, and about 40 of them are children, and Harlan Voss has just put bread out of reach of every one of them. I can grind, I can stretch it, I can put potato in it and oat in it and make it go 3 times as far as he thinks it will go. But I need the wheat, and I need it here." Abel Kincaid stood dripping on the boarding house floor and looked at her the way a man looks at a hand of cards he did not expect to be dealt. "How much do you want for it?" I want you to sell me the 40 sacks at what wheat is worth in a normal January, and I will pay you out of the tin under my wagon floor, and I will charge this town cost and not 1 cent over it, and I will write down every loaf and every name in a book, so that when this is done there is not one soul in Steadman who can say I made a profit off a blizzard. You could take the money. I could. Harlan Voss is taking it right now. That is my whole point. He was quiet a moment. I will bring the wheat in on the stone sledge with 4 horses, and I will not sell it to you. I will give it to you, and if you want to fight me about that, you can do it in the spring when I have got the time. They fought about it anyway, for about a minute and a half, and then the wind took the argument out of both of them because there was work to do. Ruth Ellery did not sleep more than 4 hours together for 9 days. The sledge came down at first light with the 4 horses steaming and Court Beeman walking at their heads, and by noon there were sacks of wheat stacked to the ceiling of the Pike back room. The old hand mill came out of the pantry, and Ruth and Odessa Pike scoured 40 years of rust off it with sand and coal oil, and then they set the boys of the town to turning it in shifts, because turning it was hot work, and any boy will do hot work if you make it a contest. The big range went and did not go out. Ruth fired it at 3 in the morning and banked it at 11 at night, and in between she baked more bread than she had ever baked in her life. She put boiled potato in the dough, and it went further and stayed moist for 3 days. She put ground oat in it when the wheat ran thin. She made a dark, heavy loaf with molasses in it that would fill a grown man on 2 slices. And when the doctor asked for something for the sick house, she made a soft white roll with milk in it, and she sent it up hot in a cloth. She wrote every loaf in a book. Name, date, number of loaves, amount owing, amount paid. She charged 4 cents a loaf, which was cost and the labor of the boys and nothing else, and where a family could not pay she wrote the loaves down anyway, with a line beside the name that said the word later. Because she had learned from her father that a debt honestly recorded and honestly forgiven is a different thing from charity handed down, and that people will take the first one and keep their spine. Alma Dieter came on the 4th day with her 3 children behind her and stood in the doorway of the Pike kitchen, unable to say what she had come for. Ruth put 6 loaves in her arms and wrote the word later in the book while the woman watched her do it. You will pay me in April, she stated. Out of the egg money. 4 cents the loaf like everybody else. I have got it written down and I will hold you to it. Alma Dieter went out into the snow crying, and she came back in April with the money. Abel Kincaid was there most of those 9 days. He hauled the water, he split and carried the wood, hundreds of pounds of it, and he did it in a canvas coat with the sleeves shoved up like any hand on any place. On the 6th night, Ruth found him asleep sitting on the flour bin with his head back against the wall and his hands still black to the wrist, and she stood in the doorway of that hot kitchen at 2 in the morning and looked at him for a good deal longer than she needed to. She took the dented pan down off the shelf, greased it, and set the first loaf of the morning to rise in it, the way she had every morning for 6 years. Then she woke him, because the water was low, and he got up and went out into the cold without complaining, and that was the exact night that Ruth Ellery stopped pretending to herself about what was happening to her. The wind laid down on the 20th. The pass opened on the 22nd, and on the last Saturday in January the Justice of the Peace came out from Coles Junction, and the whole town packed itself into the schoolhouse to watch Harlan Voss take everything the Ellery girl had. They came because they had nothing else to do. Some of them came because they were ashamed and wanted to see how it came out. Ruth understood that and did not hold it against them. Harlan Voss presented his note. He read it aloud. He read the figure of $800 twice and let it sit, and there was a stir in the room because $800 was a number most of those people had never had at one time. The justice asked Ruth whether she disputed the debt. I do. On what grounds? I have not seen the note yet. Only a copy that was left in the snow at my wagon. I would like to hold the paper itself. Harlan Voss did not want to give it to her. That was plain from the back of the room. But the justice put out his hand, and the note went across. Before Ruth could take it, Abel Kincaid stood up. He did not raise his voice. He never did. Before we go on, I would like to make an offer in front of everybody so there is no confusion about it later. The room went still. Harlan, I will buy that note off you right now. Face value. $800 cash money on that table in front of you inside of 10 minutes, and I will take my chances collecting on it myself. You lose nothing. You are made whole to the last cent you say you are owed. Somebody in the back whistled low. $800 was a year of wages for 4 men. He offered it the way another man would offer a chair. And there in the front of the schoolhouse, Harlan Voss made his mistake, because he could not take it. A note sold is a note examined. It would go to the bank at Coles Junction, and it would be filed, and it would be looked at by men whose whole business was looking at such things. I do not care to sell, he replied. The debt is owed to me, and I will have it from her. Ruth Ellery took the note out of the hand of the justice and held it up to the window light. She looked at it for a long time. The room began to shift. Then she spoke, and she spoke quietly, because she had learned from a man kneeling in a muddy street that quiet carries further than loud. My father wrote his sevens with a bar across the middle. He learned it in the war from a German sergeant, and he did it every day of his life until the day he could not hold a pencil. There is not a bar on either 7 on this page. She turned the paper. The figure has been changed. It was written $80, and somebody has closed up the space and added a naught, and the ink of that naught is blacker than the ink of the words around it. And any of you may come up here and look at it in this light, and see it for yourselves. 4 men got up at once. And there is one thing more. She held the note out flat. This note is dated the 14th of September, 1886. She let that sit. My father was buried on the 9th of September, 1886. Reverend Hollis read over him. There are 30 people in this room who stood at that graveside in the rain, and the burial is written in the church book in ink, and the church book is 40 feet from this door. The schoolhouse made a sound like a held breath let go. Harlan Voss started to talk. Nobody was listening to him anymore, and that was the moment he understood it. And Ruth watched the understanding arrive in his face and felt no joy in it at all, which surprised her. She turned to the justice. There is more. I would like the flour accounts of the Kincaid Ranch entered and the delivery bills against them from July through December. Mr. Beeman has weighed every sack that has come off a Voss wagon since the first week of December and written the weight in the book and had a witness to each one. The sacks are billed at 100 pounds. They have come in at 92, 94, 91. And in 3 months, there are 4 sacks billed that were never delivered at all. Court Beeman came up the aisle with the tally book under his arm, walking like a man going to church. And I would ask the women of this town who have carried credit on that slate over the till to think back on how many times a figure they knew was one number turned out on Saturday to be another, and whether they ever once got the argument. Alma Dieter stood up in the 4th row. She did not say anything. She just stood up and stayed standing, and then a woman near the window stood up, and then the schoolteacher, and then a freighter in the back, and in about half a minute there were 19 people on their feet in that schoolhouse, and Harlan Voss was sitting down alone in the middle of them. The justice took the note, folded it, and put it in his coat, and said that the matter would go to the county attorney at Coles Junction. and that in his opinion, Mr. Voss ought to secure himself a lawyer before Tuesday. Harlan Voss sold the Mercantile in March and went to Nebraska. The store reopened under a man named Pettigrew from Cheyenne, who put the scale where customers could see the beam and kept his slate honest, mostly because he had heard the story before he ever got off the train. The town did not apologize to Ruth. Towns do not. But something turned over in it all the same. Men who had stepped around her in the road in November took their hats off to her in March, and the schoolteacher asked her to speak to the girls about figures, and Odessa Pike, who had never given away anything in her life without an argument, offered her the front room of the old harness shop at a rent that Ruth had to talk her upward on twice before she would agree to it. The Ellery Bakery opened the second week of April, 1888. It had a brick oven that Court Beeman and 4 men off the Kincaid place built in 11 days, a counter of planed pine, and a window that took the morning light. On the glass in gold paint that cost more than Ruth wanted to admit was one word and one name. Bread. Ruth Ellery. She fired the oven for the first time on a Tuesday and let it come up all day and into the night. Abel Kincaid came in near dark with his hat in his hands and stood out of the way, which he was good at. Ruth took the dented pan down from the shelf where she had hung it, greased it with her fingers, and set into it a small plain loaf, no bigger than the ones she used to bake in a sheet iron box on a bed of river stones in a hollow outside of town, with 4 days of flour to her name. She put it in the new oven and shut the door. They sat on the step and waited for it, and the light went off the ridge the way it had that day on the porch, and neither of them said much of anything until the smell came out into the shop. Then Abel Kincaid turned his hat over one more time and asked her a plain question. In the plain way he asked everything. "Ruth, that house of mine has got 9 rooms, and I have never used more than 3 of them. I am not going to stand here and tell you I have anything you need, because I have watched you for 6 months, and you have gone and got every last thing you needed by yourself, and I would not insult you by pretending otherwise." He looked at the door of the oven. "But I would like to come down this street in the evening and find you here, and I would like you to come up that road at the end of a day and find me there. For as long as we get." Ruth Ellery looked at her hands. Flour in the creases of the knuckles, a burn across one thumb from the December range that would be a white line for the rest of her life. They will say you married the girl who used to sleep in a wagon. Let them say it. I knelt down in the mud for that girl in front of the whole county, and I have not regretted a minute of it since. She laughed, which she had not done in front of anybody in a year. And then she said yes, and she said it in a normal voice, because it was a normal thing that ought to have happened to any decent person and had somehow taken her 23 years to arrive at. They were married in June, in the church, in the second pew, with the whole town in behind them. Long afterward, when the bakery had a second oven and a girl of her own out of the Dieter family working the counter, Ruth would sometimes take the old pan down and use it for the first loaf of the morning, and Abel would ask her why she kept a bent tin thing when she owned 40 better ones. She never gave him the whole answer. The whole answer was too long for a kitchen at 4 in the morning. The whole answer was that she had once stood on a boardwalk in the cold and watched her own work thrown in the street, and had understood, standing there, that the town had decided what she was worth, and had done it without ever once tasting anything she made. And a man had come down off the walk and knelt in the mud and put it in his mouth. Not to feed her. Not to save her. Only to say, in front of everybody, in the one language that Street understood, that a thing was good, and he knew it was good, and he did not care where it had been lying. She had spent 11 months being a name people stepped around. She spent the rest of her life being a woman whose bread they lined up for on a Saturday morning with the coins already in their hands. The pan came out of the oven. She turned the loaf onto the board and set it on end to cool. It was hers. The oven was hers. The name on the window was hers, painted where the morning light would find it first. And that was the thing she had wanted all the way back at the beginning, standing in the cold with flour on her wrists and nobody at all watching her work.